Hi, I'm John Pasalis, and this is the Move Smartly show. Today, we're going to be talking about rent controls. Today's episode was inspired by a couple of columns written by two housing experts. The first by Ricardo Tranjan from the Canadian Centre of Policy Alternatives. He wrote a column in the Toronto Star arguing that rent controls work and they do not restrict the supply of housing, but they do restrict the profits of landlords. And Murtaza Haider from the Toronto Metropolitan University wrote a response to Ricardo's article arguing that the evidence is clear that rent controls restrict the supply of rental housing. Now, what was interesting is both experts were basically looking at the exact same research and coming to very different conclusions. So today I thought I'd bring on Murtaza to get his take, partly because while I don't agree with all of the arguments from both experts, I tend to agree that I think rent controls are important for tenants. I think there are other ways to stimulate the supply of rental housing that does not need to get rid of rent control. So since I kind of tend to be in favor of some form of rent control, I thought I'd bring Murtaza on to get his take on why he thinks removing rent controls is important and why he thinks that that will stimulate more housing supply. I'm going to include both of their columns in our show notes and a link to one of the KPMG and CMHC papers that they both cited in the show notes. As always, if you have any questions about this episode, you can send me an email at askjohn@movesmartly.com. And now on to today's show. Okay, Murtaza, thank you for joining us today on our Move Smartly YouTube channel and podcast. And as I mentioned in the intro, the key topic we're talking about today is, of course, rent control. And before we kind of unpack this, this bit of an intellectual debate you had in the media between yourself and Ricardo on the pros or cons of rent control, I thought actually before I even talk about maybe our first question, I should point out very clearly that I'm a slightly I'm not an unbiased interviewer. I tend to be slightly biased towards rent controls. I think I'm the only landlord in Toronto, maybe, who is. And I thought that's why it'd be better to kind of bring you on, to obviously hear your views and kind of why you think it kind of constrains supply. Now, before we talk about, some of these issues, maybe if you can unpack what we mean by rent control. I think people have a general idea, but maybe if you can kind of define just generally what that is, that'll kind of be a good place to start, I think.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. This is a good opportunity, and always great to be in conversation with you. The thing that rent controls appears to be something that people know what it means. It may be a mistake for us to assume that people know what rent control means. And in fact, the same term, rent control, could mean different things for different people and different entities. In its very strict format, rent control could mean that a government agency would determine what the rent is for any type of property by any type of landlord. So, for example, in some countries, mostly Soviet communist style places, the government can say, yeah, the rent for a one-bedroom apartment is $550. So you can charge less, but you certainly can't charge more, and the government determines it. So there's no way around it. They can say for two-bedroom, $850. That's it. So that's rent control. The government determines the rent ceiling, right? That's what rent control really means. But then these are more common, more pronounced in controlled economies like like Soviet style, former Soviet style economies were this was very common there. But in market economies such as Canada and the UK and America and others, this type of rent control in the recent past did not exist. Now, what could exist or what did exist is rent increase caps. For example, you can have the government deciding that you cannot raise the rent at renewal, that when the lease comes up for renewal after a year, the landlord is restricted to increase the rent by a certain percentage, right? That's called the rent increase ceiling. So that's one way. The other one is the vacancy decontrol, which is more pronounced in Canada. especially in Ontario. And vacancy decontrol means that the renewal of a lease at the end is governed by the government. So they will say you can increase it by inflation, 2.5% or whatnot. But once the unit becomes vacant, then it's no longer under rent control increase or requirements. Then you can charge the market rent or whatever rent the landlord thinks they need to charge. So this is the spectrum of rent control interventions. In all these interventions, the private landlord is subject to what revenue they can earn from an investment in real estate that they have made. And as you know, that from many years and throughout my training in housing, and I've got 30 years of training and reading on housing, probably more so than people who, I've not seen credible evidence, even though you mentioned debates about people, that the credible evidence that favor rent control does not exist. Now, I said this, but let me say the other part of my argument, and that is that housing is a right. Safe, secure housing is a right. People should not face a condition where they have to forego spending on other essentials to pay for rental housing. That is very clear in my mind and the values that I live with. I just don't believe that responsibility, which is a state's responsibility, should be transferred to private landlords. The governments should do their job in providing affordable housing, non-market housing for people in need. But instead of doing that, they actually say, well, why don't we shift this responsibility to someone else? And then in doing so, we saw the mishap where the rental housing construction almost disappeared from Canada since the 70s and didn't return for good 30, 40 years. And therefore, you saw this complete wipeout of rental housing construction, which is called the purpose-built rental. So the government's mistake of transferring its responsibility to the private sector and say, well, no, we will not do this. We won't do our job, but we'll make our job your job, caused the mess in rental housing that we are in today.
Okay, I mean, expanding on that, maybe you can kind of unpack how that caused that. Because I mean, in markets like Ontario, we haven't had rent control since the 90s for new purpose-built rentals, right? And we still haven't built anything, right? So maybe you can kind of unpack how the idea that the government's put in rent control is sort of the issue. And then maybe just to unpack or understand your thoughts on, you mentioned housing is a social right, but I guess that is one of the tensions, of course, with rent control, right? I mean, rent control allows a landlord to effectively increase the rent any amount. So how do you have both, I guess,
I don't think the landlord can increase it by any amount.
Pardon me?
I don't think the landlord can increase the rent by any amount. For example, if you own a one-bedroom apartment, which is your investment property,
Sure.
Can you charge $10,000 or $20,000 a month for it? That's any amount, right?
Yes, I can.
But
I mean,
nobody
if it's newly built, yeah, for sure, I can increase my tenant's rent by any amount.
No, you can, but nobody will pay it.
No, but if I want to evict a tenant, I could.
Okay, let's assume
Yeah.
You're right. Let's say you don't have a tenant. It's a vacant property.
Oh, okay, yes.
Right. And now I fully understand what you're saying. Let's say it's a vacant property. Can a landlord charge any amount?
No, of course not.
No, right?
The market, yes.
What the market bears. That's
100%.
what I'm responding to.
Yeah.
Now, what you mentioned is that if there's a tenant there and landlord increases the rent to a ridiculous amount of $10,000 or $20,000 just to evict them, but there should be laws against it. I'm fully in favor of protecting renters' rights when someone is trying to unduly evict them by raising the rent to such obnoxious numbers. But that's a separate topic. We'll come to it later.
Sure.
So what people need to know now, when I look at it, I said I've been doing this for 30 years, right? I started studying housing markets in Canada in around 1994, 95. and then went back to school in 96, did a master's and a PhD on housing at University of Toronto. So I have data that goes back to 70s or even further. Now, for some odd reason, Statistics Canada on its website and through its channels releases data as of 1990. So when I am in debates with people, I now realize that their understanding of Canada's housing markets starts in 1990, as if Canada did not exist before that. So let me take you back to 1970, and you mentioned Ontario. Let's just focus on Ontario. In 1970s, we were building far more purpose-built rental housing than we ever built since then in any given year. 1968, 69, 1970, 71. If you look at those numbers, they're very clear. In absolute numbers, when Canada's population was 20 million, we were building far more purpose-built rental housing in 1970s than today when Canada's population is over 40 million. So you say, well, but then what happened? Did we forget how to make purpose-built rental? Well, a couple of things happened. First thing was the Carter Commission. The Carter Commission so Canada has also got another tendency. We borrow heavily from whatever planning or governance regimes, changes, interventions we see in England. The UK came up with capital gains tax in late 60s, very early 70s. Right away, the Canadian government formed a commission, and it was led by a gentleman last name Carter. That's why the Carter Commission. And they spent a year or two, came up with this great idea of capital gains tax. Before that, we didn't have a capital gains tax. It also applied to rental housing, purpose-built rental housing. Now, that was a significant blow because that took the incentive away from owning purpose-built rental, because what they did not do in Canada is exempt inflation, which they did in other places, which means that if your inflation is 8, 9, 10%, and at that time inflation was high, if you own a property for 10 years, the value doubles thanks to inflation. And then when you pay capital gains, not only you're paying gains on value increase, you're fully taxed on inflation. So right away, the investor said, well, wait a second, I don't want the government to be taxing me on inflation. That was one big blow. 1970s was also the birth of rent controls in Ontario and elsewhere. That's where we came with rent controls. Now the investors say, wait, I'm investing in this project, but I don't know what my return would be because the government will decide what my cash flow will be. So they backed off. And you see a precipitous decline. If you draw a graph, it's going like this, 1972, bloop, it falls down like it's a decline, like a slide going down. Third thing was strata housing. Before 1972, 73, we did not have strata housing legislation, which is condominiums. So then there's another form of housing. So people who had the know-how of building high rises, and high rises at that moment was 5, 7, 10, maybe 15-story high purpose-built rental housing. Those builders, developers then had another opportunity to build condominiums. You put these three together, purpose-built rental housing construction disappeared in Ontario. It didn't in 1996. Around that time, it was down to a ridiculous number of under I don't know, like 1,000 maybe or something like that. Or maybe if I can eyeball some charts that I'm looking at, about 1,000, yeah. So from even highs of 5,000 or more in late 80s, it went down to 1,000, 2,000, and that's for the entire province of Ontario. And we stayed like this all the way up to 2008 and 9. So you ask yourself, in the absence of purpose-built rental construction, where else would rental supply come from? Now, usually we have in Canada about 35% Canadians who live in rental housing, more or less, right? So when we were 20 million in 1970s, right? What is 35? 7 million Canadians lived in rental, and there were tons of purpose-built rental, right? So now we are 40 million, right? So 12 million live in rental housing, and we pretty much did not build much purpose-built rental.
Mhm.
All that supply for purpose-built rental came from private landlords,
Mhm.
right? Who instead of thanking, we demonize, right? We say, oh, the big bad landlord. The purpose-built rental disappeared.
Mhm.
Private sector landlords stepped in and they provided housing.
Mhm.
So renters have to understand that in order for them to rent, someone has to take the ownership risk and
Mhm.
someone has to bear the cost of ownership. It's not necessarily written in the Canadian Constitution that let there be a class of landlords who should always buy, invest in real estate, and make it available for fellow Canadians to rent. There's no such clause in your Constitution. There's no constitutional right anyone has to ask another person to provide housing to them. You can ask the government, but you can't ask a private landlord to do that. So the private landlords did it, and they didn't do it out of goodness of their heart. They did it for profit. I
Mhm.
mean, I teach in a business school.
Mhm.
I teach the only thing that matters is incentive, and incentive is profit. So you take profit out, you have nothing. You see a
Mhm.
decline in construction, you see a decline in rental supply, and that's where we are. And I think that's the reason why I believe rent controls do not work, because they take the incentive away
Mhm.
from landlords to be active. And if people really want rental housing and they feel strongly, then convince your governments to provide it.
Mhm.
It's the government's responsibility. I shouldn't be knocking on my neighbor's door and say, I think you should be renting out your basement to me because I want affordable housing. You don't have this right to
Mhm.
fellow citizens and private landlords and private entities. If we feel strongly, then we should be forcing our governments to do that. And I'm in favor of forcing governments. You look at the housing stock. Let's just scale it down to Toronto, the city of Toronto.
Mhm.
We are 3 million people, right? The city of Toronto.
Mhm.
3 million people, roughly 1 million dwelling units, all sorts of dwelling units, 1 million, maybe one few 100,000 up or more, but very only 5% of the housing stock is affordable housing owned by the government. The Toronto Community Housing Corporation houses about 100,000 people in about 55,000 dwellings, right?
Mhm.
If you want affordable dwellings and if affordable rentals, well, why don't we ask Toronto's mayor,
Mhm.
Olivia Chow? We say, "Hey, Mayor Chow, you have only 5% of the stock is social housing in Canada, in Toronto. We know that in places like Europe, it could be 10, 15, even 20%.
Mhm.
We want you to double this stock. We don't want to fight with private landlords because we don't have any constitutional say there. But you being elected, and I'm just using Olivia Chow as an example, you can say the same thing to Doug Ford, and you can say the same thing to Prime Minister Trudeau, saying, we elected you. We
Mhm.
want safe, secure, affordable housing, non-market housing for people who do not earn enough to pay market rents. Right?
Mhm.
But I don't think you can walk up to a private land, you can knock on somebody's door, say, I know your basement is vacant, you've got a pool table there. Take that pool table out and rent your basement to me because I want affordable house. You don't have that kind of say, right? Like I'm trying to use these exaggerated
Mhm.
examples to define the limits in what we can ask for and who should we ask for. From whom should we ask for? Our asks should be to the government. And we should be very careful with the governments because the governments, instead of doing their job, instead of providing 100,000 affordable units in Toronto, may that be the mayor, may that be the premier, may that be the prime minister, they turn around and say, well, the private landlords, you're making money from this. We should be restricting your cash flow by doing this. And in so doing, they actually created the mess. If vacancy rates are 1.5% in Toronto
Mhm.
for rental properties, if rents are unaffordable, that's because rental house stock is in short supply and rental stock is in short supply because of government policies. We created an environment that we pushed out the developers and builders, and nobody wants to own, or not, you shouldn't say nobody. There's less incentive to own purpose-built rental or build purpose-built rental. I see an uptick on it. I see much of an uptick, and I'm just glancing on the stats on my
Mhm.
computer. The bigger uptick was in Quebec. In fact, Quebec was doing really well, and I was surprised. There's lots of puzzles in rental construction. Quebec has been doing great, but in the last 2 years, not as much. There's been a significant decline in Quebec, marginal increase in Alberta, some noticeable increase in rental construction in BC, all since 2007-8, the financial crisis, post-financial crisis. I think, and this is, I'm guessing, I'm still probing it. I've got a graduate student looking into it. I think the federal government has put in place incentives to build rental housing, the federal government.
Mhm.
That is showing some signs. That's my working hypothesis, but not much is happening in Ontario. Ontario is taking a lot, would require a lot more effort to build purpose-built rental, but still that decline has stopped since 2007-8 after the last big recession. And we see some resurgence, but it's not sufficient to cover the gap. We stopped building rental housing in 1970s,
Mhm.
then 80s and 90s, and all the way up to 2008. That 40 years of a lack of construction will not be covered by that 5 years of construction that we are seeing now. So here we
But
are. Red supply is the main issue. We don't create an environment to build enough, and then we end up with these conditions.
so you mentioned a bunch of things that I'd like to touch on. I mean,
Sure.
that your international comparison was a good one, but before we go sort of to talk about that, maybe we'll just kind of wrap up on sort of Ontario and Canada. And, one question I had, and you kind of touched on it, is, the government's providing all sorts of new incentives to drive rental housing, removing GST, increasing the capital cost allowance. I believe in the 70s, they had policies about recapture depreciation and obviously differences on capital gains for investment properties. So I guess one question I had was, when we think about now, excuse me, today versus the 70s, why is there so much emphasis on highlighting rent controls as the big issue rather than all of these other tax policies? Because I find that interesting, like how in the literature do economists single out that it is rent control that is the main issue rather than capital gains, recapture depreciation, capital cost allowances, HST, and I guess my question is it possible to see an increase in rental supply by focusing on all of these other policies without removing sort of the tenant security that tenants have on their existing units? And maybe you can unpack why that's the case.
I don't think that is the case. I think most comprehensive analysis covers all of these or relevant. So capital gains may not be a relevant thing in the US, so maybe they're not addressing this. But rent control on its own is a unique thing where the public sector, the government, determines what and how much profits the private sector can earn.
No, they don't. Just to be clear, they don't determine the profits. They determine the increase in your annual revenue, right?
Yes. So cash flow. So let me rephrase it.
The increase in your cash flow, not your actual profit, because that's obviously driven by other factors, but they limit how much your revenue can increase and on existing tenants only.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So let's so they determine what cash flow you can earn over time.
They constrain your cash flow, but yeah, exactly.
They constrain. And so that in private, that in an economy that is market economy is unacceptable, and it doesn't work. I give you another example. Like if this is acceptable to you, and you are a brokerage, right? You probably sell dozens of homes in a year. Why not have the same kind of thinking on housing sales? Only rents are not the only unaffordable element. Housing prices are also very high and deemed unaffordable. Well, why not have a law in Ontario that no owner can sell a property for more than 10% of the price that they paid, right? Similar to rent control, you limit the increase a person can ask for. So let's say I bought a house for $500,000. I'm selling it next year. Let there be a price control on it that only 5% increase is allowed. I should not be able to list the home for more than 5% above what I paid for.
No, but I mean, those are two very different things, because a home buyer is buying a financial asset and gets all of the upside of that financial asset over 5 or 10 years. The tenant's not buying a financial asset. The tenant's just paying for housing services.
We're not talking about a tenant. We're talking about
no, but that's the difference.
No, you're looking from So they're a buyer and a renter, a
Yeah.
buyer and a seller, a renter and a landlord. We are saying we are putting constraints on landlords in the
Yeah.
rental side. I'm saying why not put constraints on the seller on the sale on the ownership side?
Because it's a financial asset. It's completely different.
So is rental. Rental is a financial asset for the landlord.
Sure, fine. But the
Rental is a
buyer.
rental property is a
Sure.
financial asset for the landlord.
Mhm.
A home is a financial asset for the homeowner.
Yes, but the person who benefits from the services are completely different, right?
Doesn't matter.
Because
Both
okay.
are financial assets. Now we are saying, well, in this case, a financial asset, you should be allowed to recoup whatever profits you can make from it on the ownership side. If rent controls are acceptable, then there should be price controls, that no one should be able to claim more than the inflation increase since the time they have. So if I bought a house 10 years ago and the inflation has been 2% a year,
Mhm.
I should be, so the market should be restricted. So you bought a house for $500,000, inflation has been on average 2%. Let's come up with the price that you can charge, and that's a price. You cannot charge more than that price. That would solve your housing affordability issue.
I mean, I don't think those are obviously similar examples
Exactly
because
similar. See, so
they're not the
you're,
same.
they are
They're
the
apples
same.
and oranges. Yes.
No, they're not. See, from the owner's perspective, they are the same. From the owner's perspective, one person is owning a property from
Mhm.
which they are driving, they have imputed rent in that. Like in economics, we call it
Exactly.
imputed rent, right?
Of
But
course.
that's
Yes.
an ownership, an asset owned by a homeowner.
Yes.
They just draw the services from it by themselves. The
Yes.
same homeowner, can have another property and choose not to draw any
But
services from it.
But you're missing the point that the difference that you're talking about is the government does not constrain the landlord's sale price. They're
Why not?
constrained. No, because they don't. A landlord can sell their apartment building for whatever price they want.
But I'm saying
So
that if
that,
rent
but that
control is acceptable, why not
you're
price control?
you're comparing two different things. You're comparing the sales prices, which there are no constraints on the institutional investors or the mom and pop homeowner. There's no constraints on sale prices.
I
The
know.
only constraints are on the rents.
Yes, which I don't like.
Okay, that's fair. I mean,
I'm
that's what
saying,
we're talking about.
I'm saying that a house is a financial asset, right?
Yes.
A
So,
dwelling is a financial asset. Either you live in it,
but
you rent it out.
the difference, yes, okay. But in many ways, the imputed rents that I get as a homeowner are constrained. My mortgage payment doesn't go up 30% tomorrow, just like that. Like I have options. My banks are extending amortizations. They're doing all sorts of things to protect homeowners.
Yes.
The argument you're making is it's fine for governments to do everything to protect homeowners, to extend their amortizations to 40 years, to defer
No, no,
payments,
I'm
to
not
kind of
saying this.
keep their
You're saying
costs
this.
low. So we
I'm
have all these services the federal government's doing for homeowners,
No, no, I
but we
didn't say
shouldn't
this
have
is
the
okay.
equivalent for renters, is what I'm understanding.
No, no, I didn't say this. You said it, all of that.
Okay, no, but we have that. We
Yeah,
have all of those for
yeah,
homeowners.
yeah.
Homeowners are they're kind of imputed, like their out costs are being protected by the
I
government
know.
to some extent.
My argument is that housing is an asset. It's a financial asset. Like I am fully in disagreement with people. They're saying don't what is the word they use, that we have financialized the housing, and it is a
100%.
financial.
It,
There's a
no,
term that's
financialize it 100%. Yes.
housing is financialized. There's no two opinions about it, and denying it is doesn't help anyone. It's an asset, and the rent control limits the landlord's abilities to manage their cash flow, and it creates an uncertainty that discourages them from building, and that's what happened. Now, we could have a different debate if we were building lots of purpose-built rental in Canada
Mhm.
in the presence of rent controls, right? You say, well, rent controls have nothing to do with it. Look at all the supply. I would say, yeah, you're right. You know what? Makes sense. But when I look at the data and you look at the same data,
Mhm.
the rental starts have only started to show up now. And I think primarily because housing prices have gone so much up that rental is becoming a big option for people who simply are priced out of the ownership market.
Mhm.
So we have only looked at one thing. But in all this debate, I'm going to keep reminding our listeners that I am in strong favor of secure shelters for all. I just don't think that it should be taken, this responsibility should be taken from the governments and passed on to the private landlords. That's the only disagreement I would have. Now, you are suggesting that no private landlords should be subject to it. I'm saying no, governments should be the one. Raise our taxes if they say there's not enough money. Raise our taxes. The privilege of living in Canada, the privilege of living in Ontario comes with the responsibility of secured shelter, ensuring secured shelter for everyone. It means raising our taxes, sure, but it should not be the sole responsibility of someone, a partial subset of the society that chooses to own homes and invest in them and make them available as rental. It should not be only their responsibility and not the entire society's responsibility to provide rental or secure rental housing. That's my argument. I'm not interested in shifting the social responsibility from the entire collective of the society to a few who own land, who are landlords. So we have to have a uniform system. We cannot have a society where people are not earning enough to have market housing. And therefore, we need to have this. That's why Europe, in many European countries, they have 10, 15% of the housing as social housing. Now, the other thing that I haven't touched upon, and let's just look at what happens to social housing. When you constrained landlords from raising rents or keep the rents as market rents, then they stop investing in keeping the property in a state of good repair, right? The quality of rent control units declines much faster than the quality of units that are not rent control.
But
People will say,
aren't they allowed above guideline rent increases specifically
you
for
have
those
to go and
reasons?
ask for it, and it's a
Yeah.
cumbersome process. It's not by default. Like people use Germany's example. Germany, in fact, I went and studied Germany. It turns out that the above the guideline increases were by default allowed in Germany. Here, a landlord has to go and convince the government, and the tenant can still challenge. So it's a whole cumbersome process. Now, I want people to think about what happens to housing that is under rent control. And I want people to actually visit rent control units in, especially the units owned by Toronto Community Housing Corporation. It was not very long ago that paramedics refused to enter a rent control building in downtown Toronto, and a person, I think, either got seriously ill or died because of lack of healthcare, because the condition of those units were so poor.
Okay, go ahead.
No, hold on. Let me complete this thought.
Okay.
Now, Toronto Community Housing Corporation is a government agency. It's not a private landlord.
Sure.
It certainly can draw on resources that are far beyond the capacity of an individual landlord. And even then, they cannot maintain those units in a state of good repair because the revenue is constrained. And that's my argument. That doesn't matter how good your intentions are, no matter how deep your pockets are, even as a government, you cannot maintain those 50,000 units. And if you have any confusion, I work in downtown Toronto, and I'm just speaking to your listeners. Come and have a visit with me with of these rent control units, and you see what kind of state they are in. There's a lot of investment needed, and rent control owners, landlords, even if they are governments, don't have that kind of money to provide that kind of state of good repair. So therefore, there's no dispute in this. When I say no dispute, you can pick up many academic papers or analysis that rent control units, especially strictly rent control units that are under strict rent controls, often depreciate in quality much faster because the landlords do not have the impetus to improve the quality, given the fact that their rentals income streams are constrained or fixed.
So, I mean, just to expand, I mean, I think your argument about Toronto community housing might be a little bit different than the entire stock of purpose-built rentals. I mean, most of the purpose-built rentals I've seen that are owned by big REITs are not falling apart, and they're not slumlords. Like, they are rent control buildings, but in good shape. So I don't think that applies to all purpose-built rentals are in disrepair, I think was the only thing I wanted.
No, that's not my argument.
Okay,
But I'm saying that the as the rental revenue gets constrained, the
Mhm.
more the constraint, the poor the quality of the housing stock.
Okay, that's fair. So, I mean, one thing you touched on and I thought was interesting was, I mean, the arguments in rent control are really interesting, I think, when we read them in North America, because, you know, there's that old joke about if you ask 10 economists an opinion, you'll get 11 answers, right? But rent control appears to be like the one thing that most, at least North American economists kind of are on side with and not wanting them, if I'm not
Well,
mistaken,
well,
right?
look, don't I tell people don't listen to me. I haven't had my Nobel Prize yet. Not that I'm looking forward to it, and not it's going to happen in this lifetime. But Paul Krugman,
Hmm.
Professor Paul Krugman got a Nobel, right?
Hmm.
Was a professor at Princeton University. He wrote Spatial Economy. He's got tremendous work on trade, and he writes for New York Times, and one of the most prolific writers of our times, Paul Krugman.
Hmm.
And he wrote once that economists, as you said, don't agree on much. And this is what I wrote in November 2017, my first column for the National Post.
Hmm.
I quoted Krugman in that, and I said, look, Krugman said that economists seldom agree on anything, but rent control is the only thing in amongst the economists where they believe that it seldom delivers the intended objective, which is affordable housing, increase in affordable housing, and improved quality or sustained quality of it. Always hurts the renters in the long term, because those who are in rent control units, they benefit, but those who are not have a tough time getting into one because the supply disappears.
So the incentive is to build so much supply that rents don't increase, is what I'm understanding. Like,
No, the if you continue to build
yeah.
rental housing within with the rent controls in place, sure, that wouldn't be a problem. But the problem becomes that with the rent controls, the supply first declines and then it just stays like that.
But
So
our decline happened even without rent controls in Ontario, which is interesting,
no,
right?
who says that? I'm telling you, go back to 1970.
No,
The
and since 1990, I mean, our decline
Again,
happened.
Ontario wasn't born in 1990.
No, I know that.
The real damage was done in the 70s. I mean, thanks to Statistics. I just had the meeting with Statistics Canada yesterday, and I failed to understand why their databases started in 1990. It's a left-censored view of every problem in Canada, because you go and download data, it starts in 1990. Go back to 1970 and see. I mean, and if you want, for this episode, I will send you the Ontario chart I have, where I
Mhm.
show how the purpose-built rental declined from 1970s all the way to 2006 and 7. So why I'm saying this is because these things did matter. The rent control culture, no, so the culture of building purpose-built rental housing, that disappeared from Canada. See, I see the disadvantages of renting from private landlords in
Mhm.
condominiums and whatnot, because the private landlord can change their mind and say, look, I need this condo for whatever reason, you have to move out. That takes away the security of tenure for renters. That's not good. The
Mhm.
security of tenure means that a renter should be able to live as long as they please to live in a unit if they are able to afford it and keep it in a state of good repair. Then they shouldn't be worried year after year whether I'll be able to live here or not. That's called security of tenure. That's not going to come from condominiums. That can only come from purpose-built rental housing. And that housing has not been built in sufficient numbers since 1970s. And one of the big contributors to that was not just uh, capital gains or others. One of the reasons was rent controls. So I'm saying to this,
Mhm.
that if rent controls will not matter or do not matter,
Mhm.
then we should see an increase in purpose-built rental. And I must say that there has been an increase in the construction of rental units.
Mhm.
And I have a chart that clearly shows that there has been a resurgence, but the resurgence since 2008 is not sufficient to cover the gap that we
Mhm.
created over 4 decades.
That's interesting. Now, I mean, we touched on Europe a little bit, and I find these the difference is interesting because I just finished a graduate degree that was a joint program between U of T and the University of Reading, and kind of one of the positives was you get to see the North
Can
American
we
view,
can we
and
call
you
you doctor yet or no?
no, no, no. I don't want anyone confuse me with with a medical doctor.
No,
Um,
like the PhD. or
Yeah,
like
yeah,
or the
almost. Yeah,
dean.
basically, yeah.
So we
Uh,
should be calling you Dr. Pasalis now, right?
I think I might skip the doctor title, but it, doing it in the UK was kind of interesting because you get exposure to obviously their academics, and of course, some of the research and the perspectives are obviously quite different, and their approach to housing is very different. And, as you noted, I mean, rent control, of course, is very significant and very common in most European countries. The state does play a bigger role in non-market housing as well, but even in market housing, many of the countries have limits on, the profits in some cases, not even the rent growth, but even the profits that some landlords can charge, but they still build because they see it as a long-term kind of secure asset. And of course, that is like a different approach from North America. And part of me wonders, I mean, given these different views and different approaches, how much is this idea of rent control like really is it like a statistical fact, or is it just rooted in effectively like ideology, like the free market approach versus Europe, which is more interventionist? Because we talk about it like it's a statistical fact, but Europe still has rent controls and a lot of rentals and a lot of security of tenure. Despite having rent controls, they still build rental housing. So how much is rent control truly a barrier? How much is this driven by, again, like ideology? Like North America appears to be very much more free market approach to housing, whereas Europe's not.
Well, you're absolutely right that there are differences, but they're nuanced differences. Um, and Europe is not that uniform, right? So let's pick two places,
Mhm,
UK and Germany,
mhm,
right? Now, social housing is called council housing in the UK.
mhm,
And I will be hard pressed to find a single report or academic paper that praises their version of social housing. There are a few thousand papers that are you can review. Most of them are critical of the way council housing is run and the quality of council housing and all those social housing problems that I mentioned here. The Toronto Community Housing Corporation, not every building, but some buildings are in really poor state, and that's the state in council housing is in the UK. It's certainly not delivering in quality. Maybe in quantity they have housing, but in the quality of shelter space, much more needs to be there. And there's so much abundance of literature on it that I wouldn't spend more time making that point.
mhm,
On the other hand is Germany, right? The German experiment with housing was quite different. And people often say, oh, look at Germans, they are a rental society. Well, first of all, the rate at which ownership is increasing is very fast in Germany. They were predominantly rental, more than 50% rented. They are
mhm,
no longer more than 50% rental, and that rental households are shrinking as a segment of the total. But what they did is they learned from the Second World War. First of all, housing was decimated. Dresden was leveled, right?
mhm,
And there was no money, so you didn't have mortgages. So the only thing left was rental housing to be built. The state got involved, the private sector got involved, and they built tons of those.
mhm,
That's what happened in rental housing in Germany. But they made those rent controlled only for a certain period, 15 years, 20 years, and after that, the owners were allowed to charge market rent. That was a big thing the Germans did. Secondly, the above, so if they are doing renos, they were still able to go and ask for higher rents if they
mhm,
the landlords demonstrate that they have improved the quality or that they have made the changes, the improvements that were needed to keep the unit in a state of good repair.
mhm,
So all of those things were true. So German experiment worked where they did not try to limit the private sector. They enabled the private sector to provide. And in the first 2 decades, they said you are under rent control, but not after that. The other big difference between the US, North America, and Europe is not as much as ideology, but our demographics. Europeans have pretty much forgotten how to have babies. their fertility rates are very different from fertility rates in North America. Germany, after the reunion, there was an interesting article in the Economist that more than 500,000 apartments in East Germany did not have curtains on them in the windows. More than 500,000 apartments had no curtains in the window because nobody was living there. So they had oversupply of housing because the population was shrinking. So when the war in Syria happened and Angela Merkel was the chancellor, she brought in 1 million refugees from Syria because not enough workers. They had housing, they had jobs, not enough workers. Same is the case with other European countries where they have fertility rates gone down to almost 1.5 children or less per woman in prime childbearing age. The United States has a higher domestic fertility rate, even higher than Canada. So their population growth is happening. Their family structures are different. Now, many people compare Paris to Toronto or look at the average household size. The average household size in Paris and European metropolis is far smaller. In percentage terms, it's a much bigger difference. If you say, well, it's only half, we have 2.2 people here per household, they have 1.5, only a 0.7 difference. A 0.7 difference in percentage terms is a very large difference. Europeans not only have lower fertility rates, they have the population is domestically not increasing, their immigration is not as aggressive as ours, so they have housing stock that is in relative terms, their population is significantly larger. Second thing is their household sizes are very small. A lot of people who live in cities are singles or at best couples with no children. That is the big difference between North America and Europe. Here, people still are having babies. Here, even the immigrants we are bringing in are families with children. And that's a big difference. So you have a very different demand structure that would require bigger homes, wouldn't fit in those council housing or apartments that you see in Paris. I visit Europe before COVID at least once or twice a year. I had friends in Germany, I had friends in Paris, Berlin, got tons of family in all over England, would visit these places and would go and visit these housing. And I went and saw these social housing that were built in the Soviet style in Belgrade a few years ago. The demographics, you can't discount demographics. Whenever you compare housing alternatives, options, and policies between Europe and North America, start with demographics, start with fertility rates, start with household sizes, start with families with children, and then see what kind of housing alternatives are needed. I think North America may not be that far off in ideology, but very far off in demographics.
Thank you you touched on a lot of stuff I'd like to ask you, but we're approaching the end of our chat. So I'll wrap up with just one last question. I mean, turning to your column, which kind of kicked this off originally, we kind of got sidetracked and didn't have much chance to talk too much about it. So I'll maybe just ask you one question about it. And, part of the debate was he was citing papers, you were citing papers. It was just interesting as a reader to see like you both come up with kind of different conclusions. And one of the papers I believe he cited was a CMHC report. I think it was like the first one, and you talked about it. That said that, and I'm going to quote, it said something like, contrary to expectations based on the literature, the analysis did not find evidence that rental starts were lower in rent control markets than in non-rent control markets. And I think that was an analysis of Canada's housing markets. So what did you find when you read? I mean, I didn't read the papers in detail, I will confess, but what did you find when you read that, and why did you disagree with that conclusion that CMHC had about the rental markets in Canada?
Well, first, I think there was a quote in the article in Toronto Star. They quoted CMHC in quotes. Yeah. I couldn't find that particular sentence in the report. It wasn't there. So, but what has happened there is that CMHC commissions research from researchers and companies. So a private firm did that research, and then they produce a 4-page synopsis of it, which is written mostly by either written by or in collaboration with staff at CMHC. The synopsis that was quoted had a different message than what was in the actual report. So I have the time
Really?
and luxury to read both. So disconnect was, if you read the report and you look at the empirical models, I mean, the curse that I have is that I love econometrics. So I read all the models and see the parameters and the signs and significance levels and whatnot. The models showed very clearly, and they wrote about it. They said, yeah, there's evidence there that rent-controlled markets resulted in fewer starts. That's in the actual report.
But that was, I looked at that in the highlight. I think what you're talking about was, it was in the literature review where they talked about, yes, there is statistical evidence.
No, even in the literature review in the main document.
Yeah.
So the report by the consultant, I forgot who the consultant was.
KPMG.
KPMG. Actually, there was a section on literature review, and it's basically, so what has happened is that everyone is welcome to pick segments, right? If there's a 50-page report, there are different segments saying different things. I think the message in that KPMG report, or whoever wrote that report, was more nuanced. Even in the literature review, they said that, and I quoted it, that there is evidence that rent controls result in a constrained supply of rental housing in the future. So you have to read the whole report. You can't. I shouldn't be the one saying this, but if you cherry pick sentences from here and there, then you're not gonna able to get the message. The report was very nuanced, and I think for your audience, I will actually. But I think in my response, I quoted the report rather than paraphrasing it.
Yeah, you did in your article, and that's what I was confused about, because you quoted something about the literature review, which makes sense, because of course there's going to be literature that says rent controls constrain supply, and that's what one of their key finding was, that says despite the literature review, their analysis didn't find that.
No, their analysis, KPMG report is on CMHC website. Open it. It shows very clearly that the coefficient is negative. It shows it, and it's statistically significant. I remember that.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I didn't remember reading that in their executive summary. Like it definitely said that they did not find that in Canada, but
No, there's an abstract to that report. They reported all their analysis. There's an abstract to it. You feel free to read. Not only that they show it in their models, but in the second half of the report, they actually mentioned that there is some evidence that the rent controls constrain supply. So it's not just one report. We did it with everything that the Toronto Star article quoted.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Right. And we went back and we said, like, there was an article saying that a letter written by these economists have said that rent controls do not constrain. We went and saw the critique of that letter. It turned out that most of those were not housing economists, so that wasn't their field. But and those who actually quoted other papers made a mistake of understanding what was written in those papers that was the foundation of letters they wrote. So we mentioned all of that in our response. What I'm trying to say is this, that the overwhelming majority of evidence, and if you read our two pieces, you will see that overwhelming majority of evidence suggests that rent controls constrain rental supply. That has been the case. And CMHC report, read it cover to cover, and you will see it, or read the sections that we quoted in our column. They're clearly signs there. There are econometrics reported in KPMG's study that show that. Now, what is there, and I must admit this, is there's no silver bullet, that it's not an evidence that says there's absolutely no doubt remaining on this topic, right? There are two things I would say. This is the vaccine that would cure, that if you remove rent control, everything would be good. That kind of evidence is not there. This is social science. In economics, we don't get that foolproof evidence that 100 studies were done and they all concluded the same. There will be nuances, but those nuances are there and enough for one not to advocate rent control. There's enough evidence in economics literature. There's enough evidence in the same reports. Like, if people have to take time, the way we took time, I had to spend a week and a half just reading everything. You have to spend time to realize that the evidence that one needs to say rent controls work, certainly missing in every document that we reviewed. And that's what we are saying. That don't take my insistence that rent controls hurt as foolproof evidence that rent controls are good or bad. I'm just saying that when you read, you realize that there's not sufficient evidence to say that rent controls do not hurt renters. There is enough. That's why people like Paul Krugman, who have far deeper understanding of economics than I would, have clearly said that economists agree on this, that rent controls hurt those who are not in rent control units but would like to be, because the supply gets constrained. That's the thing. People who are in rent control units definitely benefit from it. There's no two opinions about it. They benefit from it because they're in rent control units. But what about the other? The Canadian population increased from 20 million in 1970 to 40 million. The number of renters increased from 3 million in 1970 to 7 million by today. Those additional 4 million would have had a much tougher time to find rental units under rent controls than they would have if we had been continuously building more purpose-built rental housing. If anything, we need to put focus back on purpose-built rental housing construction. That's step number one. And equally at the same time, we need to build non-market housing for people who do not earn enough to pay market rents. That's social housing. That's a responsibility of the governments. Let governments do their job. Let us not help governments shirk their responsibility and transfer it to private landlords. That's not a good way of dealing with housing.
All right, Murtaza, thank you so much for all of your feedback. We're going to include your article, the CMHC one, all of that in our show notes so people can read them. But thank you so much again for taking the time to share your thoughts on rent controls in Ontario and in Canada. Thank you.
My pleasure. Take care.